Welcome, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron. I'm president of Our Energy Policy. I can't tell you how delighted we are to see live faces in a personal setting where everyone can interact. And it's been a long time, but we are really thrilled to be back on our schedule of bringing people together and doing these live events. And it obviously couldn't be more interesting times that we are operating in. In fact, I was reminded of how interesting they were. Somebody asked me if this was wine, and I said, no, it's Diet Coke. I said, yeah, it's interesting times, but I don't need to drink wine at 11:30. So in any event, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I also want to thank all of you and our thousands of members of our energy community around the country for having been so supportive during the COVID period of the webinars that we put on. We got great feedback on those, and so as part of our program, we've now expanded to really being a virtual and live organization. So as we resume our live events, we are also going to continue our webinars. We've also expanded as the feedback we've received from government officials, federal level, state level, municipal level, have urged us to extend the dialogue that we promote and facilitate to working sessions. So we've been conducting smaller roundtables that are more roll-up-your-sleeves working sessions where, just like here, we bring together people from very diverse perspectives to sit down and work through the problems that we'll often discuss at the higher level in a webinar or in a live event like this, and really work toward reaching consensus or identifying innovative approaches to solving the difficult problems that we're all dealing with. I do want to say that we feel at OEP that it's more important than ever that we're able to bring together such a diverse, eclectic group really representing all corners of the energy sector. And if you look around the room, we have people here from utilities, from oil and gas, from clean energy, from academia, from finance, from law, nonprofits, advocacy groups, so forth. Really getting everyone together to engage in the kind of serious substantive dialogue that we know is necessary to reach workable solutions to the issues we face does feel more important than ever. And we started this some 10 years ago when it seemed like there were a lot of silos and people were not talking to each other as much as at each other, if they spoke at each other at all. And of course, I think we all recognize that it seems even more important today to get people together who are focused on solutions rather than simply stating their piece. So I thank all of you for being here and part of that effort, being so supportive. I particularly want to thank our partners. They're all listed here. We have many, and also very diverse supporters from across the energy spectrum. Our whole community across the country of 9,000 plus energy professionals and leaders everywhere. I'd like to recognize two of our board members here, Sarah Fitz, and where is he, Michael Cohen, and there he is, and for your help and support in everything that we do. And what I'm really delighted to do now is just to ask Mark Borowski from BP, our co-host for this event and a strong supporter of OEP, just to come up and say a few words, and then we're going to get Doreen and Sadie up here to engage in what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation. Mark?
Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate that, and appreciate this opportunity. As Bill said, I'm Mark Borowski. I'm on the government affairs team with BP, based down in the DC office, joined here today by a few of my colleagues. Nate Weiss took over my old role as the government affairs director here for the New York and the rest of the Northeast, so he's preoccupied with running around and repairing all the damage that I might have caused when I was doing the job. Olga Kristikova supports our gas and low carbon energy businesses, and so she's obviously very busy right now and probably has a lot of interesting things to talk about. And then Bill recognized Michael Cohen, who is our economist, our lead economist here in the U.S. and also a OEP board member. We are really excited to partner with OEP on events like this, particularly here in New York. In fact, the relationship between BP and OEP started here in New York. We were introduced and we got to talking about the prospect of doing an event focused on how a carbon price the role a carbon price might play in helping New York achieve the mandates of what was then the newly passed CLCPA, something that we think is still a relevant topic for discussion. But as companies like ours seek to get to net zero and to help the world get there, we recognize the critical role that we, with our resources and our know-how, must play in the energy transition. But well-designed government policy is also critical. It provides companies like ours the certainty that we need to make large and long-term capital investments that are needed to help make that transition a reality. And crafting that well-designed policy starts with it's a complicated process that starts with a dialogue among a broad range of stakeholders, as Bill said. And we value the role that you play in bringing those diverse stakeholders together for that dialogue. And we certainly recognize the state of New York and Doreen Harris for being at the forefront of visionary climate and energy policy. And that's why we're excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and we're very grateful to BP for co-hosting the lunch today and to all of our partners. So I'm now going to introduce, and it is my extreme pleasure to do so, because returning to live action with a conversation that you're about to hear between Sadie McKeown and Doreen Harris, I think could not be more timely and more on point. They will have a wide-ranging conversation across all of the things facing New York State, as well as things coming out of Washington like the Infrastructure Act and the IRA, everything from solar and wind to nuclear and hydro to oil and gas, and all the things that are part of the mix that we need to deal with to address our energy future. Both of these people need no introduction. Sadie's been president of Community Preservation Corporation and been with that organization for many years and heads up the field offices, investment, lending, strategy, and so forth. I mean, really an enormous contributor to our community. And Doreen Harris has been at NYSERDA in various roles and now leads that organization. Before that, various roles within the energy sector. And so we couldn't possibly have two more exceptional and insightful people to lead this discussion. They'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So as you all are listening, feel free to jot down some softballs or hardballs. I don't know. No curveballs, but jot down some questions, and we'll open it up to questions for the last 20 minutes or so. So Doreen and Sadie, thank you very much.
Going to start here. Oh, not good.
I think I'll wait on the water.
Not good. Oh,
So, thank you, Doreen.
you're welcome, Sadie. My pleasure.
This is
Thank you,
a
Anthony.
fireside chat, not a fire hose chat.
Exactly.
All right.
Oh my gosh.
As introduced, you really are
Yeah.
all wet over there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So as introduced, my name is Sadie McKeown, and I'm with the Community Preservation Corporation. I speak a lot. I speak mostly to housers and people that finance or work to construct affordable housing in neighborhoods. So you're kind of a new audience for me, which is exciting. I've been working at CPC forever, 31 years, and we like to think that we've been in the energy efficiency business since 1974. When we started renovating existing occupied buildings and making them more energy efficient with insulation and pipe wrap and better, all kinds of better roofing, et cetera. So for us, it's been an evolution. And in my personal evolution in this space, I got very involved in policy. As policy started to impact the work that we do at CPC, particularly in affordable housing, we partner a lot with government. And so I was able to participate in the Climate Action Council process on a subcommittee around buildings and energy efficiency, met Doreen and all of the wonderful people at NYSERDA, who I've also been working with, a number of them for 20 plus years. And then Doreen asked me to be on her board. So I very fortunately sit at the board level at NYSERDA. I'm also on the board of the New York State Housing Finance Agency. So that policy piece that connects housing and energy is a really important piece. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for hosting me. And thank you for asking me to have this chat with one of my favorite people, who's also one of my heroes. So just want to start with that.
Well, thank you, Sadie. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this discussion. The secret sauce for me was now I get to ask Sadie questions. So we'll probably have some dialogue back and forth in that respect, but really, really glad to be here with you and obviously with all of you today. I'm so appreciative of Bill and the whole team for inviting me in the first instance.
So let's start at the top and look very broadly at what the Climate Act is really meant to do. So we have the CLCPA. I know you guys are very busy standing it up and figuring out what it'll take. So why don't you start by setting the stage on what the Climate Act is meant to do and how the state intends to do it.
Yeah, sure. I think it is important. I'm sure we all know sort of the headlines that are part of the CLCPA, and I think notably the goal contained within it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. And I think what's pretty unique about New York is that not only have we set those goals in place, which are critical and nation leading, but also we've set forth a process to actually, as you said, Sadie, describe what it takes to achieve those objectives. And I think that's really where we sit today. I co-chair the Climate Action Council with DEC Commissioner Sagos, and we have had many, many meetings over what has been about a 2-year period, in which we have been informed by sector-specific advisory panels. We have heard from the public at large over a series of not only public hearings, but thousands and thousands of written comments. And we have conducted what I would say is rigorous and important analysis as to sort of answering that fundamental question, which is what has to happen in every sector of our economy to reach the goals of the climate law. And I think that is where the unique part of New York State comes into play, is because now I am able, and you are able, to talk about this in terms that people understand, which are quite different than GHG reductions, which are literally how does this impact people's lives, and ultimately what changes and at what pace will be necessary to reach those goals. So I think, as I sit here today, it is the case that we are talking about a change across, again, as I said, all sectors of our economy, but a change that is occurring at a pace that I consider to be actually quite liberating, Sadie, because it is not that we're talking about incremental change, nor changes that can be measured in terms of baby steps. We're talking about orders of magnitude changes across every way in which we live and work. And we're talking about changes that will occur in actually the not too distant future. Certainly some of the goals of the Climate Act allow us to conduct long-range planning as we think about, for instance, 2050. But the 2030 goals are very, very near in time, and they're very, very aggressive because of the need to really get moving sooner than later. And that's really where I'm focusing my time these days, is really thinking about these 2030 issues, given the proximity that we're talking about.
They are right on us, as is 2024, which is that first hurdle for Local Law 97, which for practitioners like me is bracing. It's a real wake-up call. I just want to give a shout out to NYSERDA and to the state of New York for convening the Climate Action Council and really trying to hear from practitioners. I consider myself a practitioner, and you can be up here in the policy space, but unless you're informed by the practitioners, sometimes you get the policy not wrong, but you miss a little bit, because if you can't push it down and make it work, then what was the point? And so I really am very, very appreciative, and I really enjoyed my role in that process. And I will say the one thing about the pandemic, the process started right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were all so desperate for something to do that every one of us logged on 3 minutes early, and it was 2-3 times a week for about 8 months. And so much came out of that process, including relationships, which I think is something that's really important, because policymakers need to have relationships with practitioners so that you don't just have one conversation, but you have an ongoing conversation. So I really want to appreciate that. The work that I do as a practitioner is around buildings, but let's start with the grid, because I think that's the big Megillah. I can talk all I want about electrifying buildings. I get comments from practitioners that I work with around, well, if you do that, you're going to blow up the grid, or New York City couldn't possibly handle all that electrification, or electricity is too expensive. So I'm really interested, and I tell everyone, because I'm on those NYSERDA board meetings, that the state has a commitment to and is doing a great job of cleaning that grid, and so that we can get there. So I want to hear about what your priorities are for the grid and how that transition is going to happen.
Yes,
or is happening, really.
Yeah, it already is, and I see many familiar faces in the room today who are really part of that transition. This is, I would say it's the place that New York started, and it's the place where many states start, because believe it or not, I know for those of you building these projects, you would disagree with me, but it's the easier part of the transition. Nothing is easy, believe me, absolutely nothing is easy. But the reality is, sort of, the grid is something that people do not have, I will say, a personal relationship with. And for those reasons, people are perfectly happy, as a general matter, if they turn their lights on or flip the switch and the light comes on. And as such, when we think about how to transform the grid, it is not necessitating the societal changes that I think are necessary to address the challenges in the buildings and transportation sectors in particular, but others as well. And I say this because, of course, there's parts of the grid that are personal, distributed energy resources, and others certainly get very close to home. But as a general matter, it is the case that a state like New York moved forward policies many decades ago to begin that transition through the original RPS programs that many states adopted. New York really had accelerated our RPS into the clean energy standard, and really set forth goals that ultimately were embodied within the CLCPA, but were those that we sort of knew how to do. What has been particularly challenging in the world of challenges has been the scale of the transformation that we are talking about in New York and beyond. And as we talk about buildings and transportation, electrification does become a central solution for many of the goals, the achievement of many of the goals we're talking about. And so as a result, we think about a massive change within our grid. First of all, our grid is expected to become a winter peaking grid in the not too distant future, in the 2030s timeframe, because of the utilization of these technologies like heat pumps. Our grid is expected to expand with peak load increasing by 50% in that next decade or two. And so what that means is when one says 70 by 30 or 100 by 40, the denominator is increasing at a fairly rapid pace. And so the reliance on the grid, not only with respect to the scale, but also the reliability concerns associated with it, become, as I would agree with you, Sadie, sort of a central tenet of any decarbonization policy. And so in New York, I'm really confident and happy and pleased that we had that early start. We really ramped up NYSERDA's procurements of renewables in every possible space, whether it be land-based renewables, offshore renewables, renewables brought into the city, distributed renewables, et cetera. All that to say, when I think about where we will be sitting in 2030, I feel quite confident that we will see that 70% renewable grid. The question that is before me is, of course, what do we need to set in place to realize that objective? And those are the processes we've instituted as a state to address siting issues, address grid interconnection issues, address grid upgrades, and the like. 2030 is one thing. 2040 is quite another, actually. New York's goal is 100% zero emission by 2040. And that's when we'll start to talk about resources that are beyond renewables. What will New York advance in terms of the retention of our existing nuclear fleet? What will we advance in terms of new zero emission technologies? And really, what technologies will be brought to bear that are broader in terms of innovation, contributing to the resilience of the highly decarbonized grid of the future. This is where the tailwinds provided by the federal government, I think, are incredibly critical. I have to say that this year, with the trifecta, as I like to call it, our infrastructure, CHIPS, and IRA have created a circumstance in which New York is going to see a significant improvement, first of all, in the costs of this transition, largely brought about by the tax credits, part of the IRA. We just presented to our Climate Action Council a $70 billion benefit coming our way in the way of reduced costs on New Yorkers. That is exactly what we needed to not only minimize impacts to ratepayers, but also to bring forth those technologies of the future, including technologies that the federal government is investing in, such as hydrogen, such as advanced nuclear, and beyond. These are the technologies that we similarly will be needing into the future.
Agree. So you talked about your prioritization for renewables, but break it down for me. What is wind? What is solar? What is hydro? Where is it coming from? What have you procured so far? Like, where are we in the process?
Sure. Yeah, well, when we look at our grid right now, New York's grid is about 27% renewable. Most of that is hydroelectric power that's been installed for quite some time,
From
or
Canada.
imported. We have large hydroelectric facilities in state as well. We have about, depending on the day, 3-4% coming from solar and land-based wind. We have about 29% coming from nuclear power, and the balance is from fossil fuels. And so when we think about the transition that we're talking about, it is a very rapid build out of renewable energy that will bring us from that 27% to 70% in what is only a few short years. The reason that I'm feeling good about this is because we have been really working hard to move projects forward in the state for what has been multiple decades. When we look at the pipeline that NYSERDA has under contract today, understanding that some of those projects will most likely not get built just due to attrition, the contracted pipeline would bring us to about 66% renewables. Again, that's not a precise number, but the point is we've got a huge pipeline that needs to get built and needs to deliver toward our goals. So I think the duration of these projects as to how long it takes to get them built is a particular challenge, because when I think about trying to hit a 2030 goal, pretty much any action that I take after 2025 will have very little impact on 2030. And that's sort of the fact of the matter.
Right.
So when I think about what we need to be doing today, it's allowing my future self to thank me for what was done today.
Excellent. And so the big goal of 9,000 megawatts of wind by 2035. 2035 is pretty close. Yeah. How long does it take to develop it, and where's it going to go?
You can ask Mark that, but no, certainly offshore wind ended up being a very significant game changer for New York and frankly for many coastal states increasingly, because it is the case that when we thought about how to get to 70 by 30, the city and Long Island were just really tricky nuts to crack. They remain very challenging. I'm sure we'll talk about buildings. But as to the grid, the NYSO reports are not incorrect in saying that the downstate grid it's just about as dirty as the upstate grid is clean. And when we thought about how to really address New York City and Long Island, and we saw the potential that offshore wind could bring, at least theoretically, I have to ask John Rhodes what he was thinking, but John Rhodes and I said, we really need those prices to come down in Europe, and then it'll be a real deal for New York. And we had our eyes set, on a period that might be, years or decades in the making. But when we saw the sort of European market move in such a substantial way in bringing forward not only scale, but prices that were sub $100 a megawatt hour, that's when we said, it's time to go. And it's time to take that industry and not only move it to the US, but move it to New York, and do so at a similar scale that will drive not only the further cost reductions we need, but also the supply chain investments that are frankly necessary given the literal enormity of the projects as to how significant they are in size. So our goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind is one that we're about halfway there in terms of our contracts. We are definitely not halfway there as to the ultimate goal, I think, for offshore wind. The Climate Action Council's integration analysis would say that we could easily double that goal to really support that broader grid build out. And that's something we'll be thinking about in the coming couple of years as we think about the broader opportunities that offshore wind presents, and also sort of the necessary preconditions for a build out of that scale. But 9 gigawatts of offshore winds will serve maybe 30% of New York's load, just to give you some sense of scale. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
It is a big deal.
Yep. I agree.
So that is very impersonal for me. I don't have a view of the Long Island Sound. I'm sure it'll get much more personal for people as those projects start to develop. But let's talk some more about other technologies that NYSERDA is supporting that might be a little bit more personal before we get really personal and talk about buildings.
All right.
So what else is NYSERDA supporting on the technology side to get to the goals?
Well, I mean, we talked a lot about sort of the generation assets that we're bringing forward. The thing that we at NYSERDA need to be doing is investing today in the technologies that will be necessary in multiple decades, perhaps. So little known fact, maybe NYSERDA, has the name R&D in its name. We invest heavily in innovation, and we have a large portfolio that has generated just incredible leverage from investments that we've made in entities. As example, Brookhaven National Lab is a great example of places where we see those investments being leveraged many times over. And I would say that when we think about sort of where we need to be investing, the grid and sort of technologies of the future are a place NYSERDA is spending a lot of time and money in investing in today. We have announced and are planning to lead and are leading an application to the federal government, as an example, to host a hydrogen hub here in New York and in the US Northeast. We have 6 states and 60 partners coming together to compete for up to $8 billion of federal money, as an example of sort of knowing that we think we can not only lead but benefit from those investments. We're investing in other forms of long-duration energy storage. The governor just announced $17 million, including a really cool application at 9 Mile Point up north in Oswego, where we're using pink. We're producing pink hydrogen and using.
What is pink hydrogen?
That is hydrogen produced by electrolysis coming from nuclear power. So pink. I know.
Gotcha.
Go figure. All that to say, that's the type of investments that we know will be necessary in the future, because it is not the case that we'll be able to rely only on those that we're using today. So I think that's only going to become more important for NYSERDA and frankly for the nation at large moving forward.
So one of the things that's funded in the Inflation Reduction Act is carbon capture. Mm-hmm. And I know NYSERDA hasn't really talked that much about carbon capture, but I have a cartoon version of the world. And when I think about all the buildings out there that are producing all of that carbon, burning fossil fuel, I think about trying to get them to convert to electricity, and then the cartoon kicks in, and I think, why not just put like a filter, a carbon capture filter on every chimney? Or I know that's not going to ever happen, but why aren't you focused on carbon capture? Because it feels like it could be part of the solution, particularly as we transition.
Yeah, and I think ultimately there will be areas in which, sort of, as I would think about it, as a last resort, those types of technologies will be utilized, not only in our state, but broadly. I would just say for New York, it is not our starting position, because we know that there are technologies and approaches that can be brought to bear to ensure that we are complying not only with the climate law, but actually achieving the objectives that we set out. So we have some money in these technologies. We have, in fact, maybe the RFP's on the street right now. Who knows? We have a natural carbon solutions RFP that we'll be issuing very shortly, looking at how to take carbon and use it for valuable products, as an example. But it is the case that New York's climate law is, I would say, when we say it's the most ambitious in the nation, like, there's implications of being that.
Right.
Entity. And that means that there's so few emissions that we can actually have in our state that technologies like carbon capture at their current levels of efficiency really don't solve the problem before us. So certainly I imagine that there will be these hard to decarbonize applications for which those types of technologies will be needed, but it is definitely not our starting point.
Understood. And it doesn't get at people's behavior, because at the end of the day, they're still using fossil fuel, and that's the holy grail, is to get everyone off of fossil fuel. And so I think this is where it starts to get a little bit more personal. And let's talk a little bit about electrification of buildings and how we transition equitably. Because the other big thing in the legislation, or in the Climate Act, and in the resources coming from NYSERDA as well as from the federal government, is that 40% or more of those resources be invested in an environmentally just way. So maybe set the stage for what environmental justice looks like to you and to NYSERDA, and how what you're doing is addressing that really important, critical piece.
Sure. Yes, so New York's climate law, at least at the time that it was passed, was seen as quite forward-looking with respect to the provisions that include the one you described, Sadie, which is that we ensure that at least 35% of the benefits of our investments accrue to disadvantaged communities, which is a term in the law. I use that term because it's what the law says. It is not a term that is really commonly used today in this way. But what the law was intended to set forth is actually a model that we now see replicated in the federal context, or at least attempted to replicate in the federal context, which is to say that essentially it necessitates different variables of different measures of success. No longer do I measure our success at NYSERDA simply by a GHG reduction metric. An equally important metric is where our investments are going and to whom they are benefiting. And I would say that is critical, because it is the case that with respect to climate change and addressing it, you can't do what you always used to do, because that's how we got here in the first case. And so I find that central not only to my personal thinking, but also it is the case that if it weren't a component of our law, I'll tell you what we would have to be doing, which is we would be deploying capital in the same way that we always did, because it achieves the fastest and most leverage for our dollar, which has been the measure of success of many policymakers historically. And Sadie, I know this is central to your work. What it means is that we have a way in which we need to work that requires more effort, it requires more people, it requires perhaps less leverage, not always, but sometimes, and it necessitates putting those communities first in how we build policies and programs as well. And that's a big change, not only for NYSERDA, but it's a big change for every other obligated entity across New York State to think about in that way. Because much like the act of addressing this crisis, it is not the case that, sort of what you always did can really work. And so I'm actually super pleased. I know you heard the report from our board meeting that we're really seeing, at least in our Clean Energy Fund portfolio, some investments that are meeting or exceeding those objectives, but it has had to be quite intentional. And I think the challenge, the dual challenge that we face, is one of really needing to move very quickly, but deliberately. And those two end up being challenging to reconcile in every decision that we make.
So
how do you think about it?
Well, I want to pick up the word you used, which is intentionally.
Yep.
And when I think about capitalism and the work that we do around buildings or around technology or innovation, it always goes to capitalism, to the bottom line. And I think with respect to addressing climate, you have to be very intentional in considering more than just that bottom line and thinking about it not as a cost, but as an investment. And I think right now, when it comes to climate, people think of it as a cost because that's all it's been, because all we've done is spend money cleaning up after one storm after another, or one fire, or one major catastrophe. And so there's a cost associated with that versus an investment. And if we took the money that we're spending on the cost side, cleaning up, and invested it in resilience and prevention and grid and the transition, we could get there much, much more quickly. And that requires policy and regulation to very specifically address climate. And the reason that I think about it this way as a practitioner, again, is, and you know, CPC and the affordable housing community has been a leader in sustainability across the country, and really a lot here in New York and New York City. And that's because creating a more sustainable apartment or a more resilient community is better for the residents that we're serving, who have struggled around affordability and around all of the negative outcomes of climate. And so what we do is hard anyway, because we're marrying all these different sources to get to affordability because the capital markets don't provide. And so adding climate makes sense for us. And so if it's hard, that's okay. You know, we're intentional about that. And so, you know, when I think about policy and regulation, I think about the Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed in 1976, which created an environment where capital providers, banks primarily, had to address poverty. Poverty was a cost, right? And there was no resource to address poverty if you were just solely focused on capitalism. So you had to create regulation to say to capital providers, you can't ignore poverty, you have to invest in disinvested neighborhoods. And so starting in 1976, banks either invested through intermediaries like CPC or other not-for-profits, or created departments within their own institutions to say, we can do this. And why? Well, we're regulated, we have to do it, and if we don't do it, they won't let us do all the things that we want to do. But over time, they realized this is a good investment. It was no longer a cost, it became an investment. And so when I think about climate, if we don't invest now, then we will continue both on the cost side cleaning up after storms, but also subsidizing the cost of energy to individuals, which we do now. We subsidize the cost of energy for low and moderate income people all the time in the form of less efficient buildings. I can't tell you how much HUD spends on energy that they shouldn't be spending if they had very efficient buildings that were, you know, focused on energy efficiency and the cost and made that a priority investment. So when I think about intentionality, I think about changing the systems that we currently have rather than creating a whole new industry to try to address climate. I don't think, and I'm on the advisory of the New York Green Bank, and that sits at NYSERDA, so I very much appreciate the work that the Green Bank has done, really trying to activate markets mostly around technology and solutions. But every bank should be a green bank or a climate bank. Every bank should be addressing it. If we don't engage capitalism in the solution through investment, we're never going to get there. Because even though $369 billion is a lot of money in the IRA, it's a drop in the bucket when you think about the trillions of dollars that are invested just in the mortgage markets, much less in all kinds of other real estate markets. And so, and you know, business market investments and everything else. The other thing that I'll point out that's coming is risk. when you make an investment, the promise to the investor is that you will disclose the risk in that investment. And they buy that and price it based on that risk. And we do that in real estate all the time. And I disclose about the borrower's financials and the market and the rents and the condition of the building. I don't disclose about climate. And for the first time, I was at a conference during Climate Week where HFAs, housing finance agencies, were talking about issuing 30-year bonds in Miami when in 30 years the projects might be underwater. And so all of a sudden now it's not that many investors in real estate invest for 30 years. They do it in affordable housing. And that's one of the reasons why, is because the shorter the investment, the less risk you're taking. But people are waking up to, whoa, there's real risk here if we don't do this. And so if we start pricing in those risks, the cost of debt, the cost of capital, the cost of investments goes up. And rather we can focus on the investment to create an environment where we're bringing that risk down wholesale. I like to think about it also as wholesale solutions, which I think we're so lucky in New York to have NYSERDA thinking broadly about those wholesale solutions, so that the practitioners like me can go out and retail those solutions in the blocking and tackling of the everyday one building at a time solution. So I wonder what NYSERDA is thinking about when it comes to the IRA and the resources available and the tailwinds you talked about.
Yeah, so thank you for that perspective also, though, on how to actually address the market. I think that's really, when I think about how to achieve the goals of our climate law, and specific to your question, how to leverage the IRA funds, as much as I would like to think that we could sort of force this all through the system ourselves, we just can't, and we shouldn't, really. And that's been, I guess, the beauty of the Climate Action Council process has been that it has sort of, it's like Thanksgiving dinner, right? It puts everybody at the table together, and you're going to have a meal, and you're going to figure it out together. And that is true both of the members that represent agencies, right? Commissioners of various agencies, as well as other members. In that, really, when we think about the changes that we're talking about, it will occur in agencies like HCR, it will occur in the Department of State, it'll occur in all of them. Name the panoply of agencies. It impacts all of us. And similarly, with respect to the IRA and the other federal funds, it is not the case that NYSERDA necessarily is the recipient of every dollar coming in from the federal government. It's going to flow across many agencies. And as such, we really are, I think, in a great position not only to maximize our leverage of those funds, but also for the agencies themselves to utilize them for the purposes that we are now very easily able to articulate. So the money is coming in various ways. The most dominant way will be by tax credit, and that it will be a process that obviously the private sector will maximize the utilization of those tax credits. We also receive money on a basis of like a formula funds. So when those come in, NYSERDA specifically is well equipped to leverage them and move those forward. And then there's competitive opportunities. Certainly, there's a variety of opportunities that we've already begun to advance. I mentioned the hydrogen hubs as a great example of that. Our New York Green Bank may well be competing for some of the investment coming from the EPA, et cetera. All that to say, it is the circumstance that we have, I think, the preconditions that many states don't to really maximize that leverage, and that alone is a huge win for New York. Many states just really don't even know where to start.
I would agree with that, and I do think New York is a huge leader. One of the things that I think about when I think about the IRA is that what the country needs is a USERDA, a United States Energy Research and Development Authority, because those of us that are in the blocking and tackling every day take NYSERDA for granted. I can pick up the phone and call any number of people at NYSERDA and get an answer to any odd question I might have about heat pumps or about electrification or building code. There are so many complications in this whole process that without that helpline, as a practitioner, you just put it down. And the two words value engineering are horrible. They're horrible words for us. because those are the first things that go in a project that wants to reach towards decarbonization. And that's one of the things that the IRA makes me excited about is, so if we're not going to get regulation, if we're not going to get a climate investment act, like a community reinvestment act, which that would be very challenging to do, I think what the IRA does, though, is give us incentive capital. Mm-hmm. So all of us that are doing the work, particularly in low and moderate income communities and in disadvantaged communities, we address what we address based on the money that we're taking in. So we're addressing affordability because that's the money we can access from government to create affordable housing. We don't address climate in the work that we do routinely because we don't have a resource to do so. Well, enter the EPA's program, and there is $20 billion in there for not-for-profit lenders. So my dream for that is that every CDFI, I'm a community development financial institution, and credit union across the country that's either a subrecipient, could be a subrecipient or direct recipient, should be using that money with their existing products to say, okay, we're going to provide affordability in this 200-unit apartment building. Now I have this extra resource so that I can make it net zero or net zero ready. And it's complicated because what we can do here in New York is not what they'll be doing in Alabama or Florida or Texas or California, but that's why we need a USERTA with regional hubs that will help guide what happens in those different geographies. And we have an opportunity here one time. It's not a lot of money, but if we don't leverage it and do it right and do it well and do it so that it can sustain itself over time, they're not going to give us more money. So we really have to have success. That success will then inform further policy and further regulation. So one of the things we really pushed for at CPC was the low-income housing tax credit to be boosted so that every LIHTC deal, every affordable, it's the largest housing program in the country, every LIHTC deal now has to become net zero ready. That's simple to me. You just increase that increment. It didn't happen in the IRA, but if we use some of those resources from the EPA to show that that is a model for accelerating electrification and decarbonization of affordable housing, at the end of the rainbow of EPA money, we can then inform the government that this is something that we were able to do with that money that accelerated this process, and so they can then make additional structural and intentional changes. So it's exciting to me.
I think the other thing beyond the points we've already made that is important about the federal investments that we're seeing is that, despite what I might say in some circles, it is very critical that we are part of a movement that is bigger than our state. Certainly, we are nation leading, there is no doubt about that. But it is the case that what we're talking about can't really happen if others aren't coming along. And by that, I mean, we really need not only a global movement, but we need the market shifts that afford the scale and the technology solutions and the sort of cultural changes that are necessary to not only achieve our goals, but frankly, to really adopt these technologies at the scale necessary to reach the goals that are afforded from a federal perspective. So like a great example that I think has been interesting, I was looking, obviously, the juxtaposition of all of this with the global energy crisis is really quite, I don't know what to say. It's a factor that we need to really think about in the context of the transformation that we are advancing here in New York. I look at the winter and, I'm frankly quite concerned about not only issues of supply, but issues of price and frankly how everyone will really pay their bills this winter and stay warm here in New York. I say that because it is the product of something that has very little to do with New York itself, right? We are reliant on fuel sources that come from places far away and have implications on all of us. This transition, of course, has that level of sort of bringing these resources to bear and domestically, which I think are important, but also to bring forth solutions that I think will really benefit from the scale now afforded by the federal investments that we see. So like a point of reference, let's just talk about some numbers here just to try to put this into context. You know, we talked about buildings as an example. 6 million buildings, 8 million households, lots and lots and lots of buildings across our state. We are in the low single-digit percentage of adoption of the technologies that are the central technologies that will be necessary to reach our goals here. Actually, same holds true for electric vehicles. Low single-digit adoption, needing to literally flip on its head in the next 7 or 8 years from adoption rates of new purchases from 5% to 80% or 90%. Those are the numbers that we're talking about here. That only happens if there's a whole movement, there's a lot of people doing it, and we see the market maturation, the technologies moving forward, and the solutions really being part of our day-to-day lives that make this commonplace. Like, that's the only way that happens. And so when I see the IRA and the investments associated from the federal government, but also the movement of other states that come along with the territory, I think that's the way in which we can really be talking about realistically the social changes that are necessary to reach these goals. And by the way, it's possible. Norway, 85% heat pump sales last year. Same with EVs. Cold climate, very similar. It's totally possible. What it comes down to is all of the pieces coming together to make it happen. And I think, where we sit today, those preconditions definitely exist. I really think when we look at the adoption rates of these technologies, it's an inflection point. It's a point at which 5% may seem like a low number, but it's actually a much higher number than it was a few years ago. Right. We're at a moment where we've got this momentum building and the transition happening in a way that makes me think about 2030 with a lens of optimism. But that's the other reason that this is all important.
Yeah, I mean, we are certainly at the early stages of early adoption.
Yep.
But if you look at the bell curve, I mean, the tipping point is not that far away. You don't have to get to 85% to have tipped. You have to get to like 20 or 23% before it starts to become commonplace. I think, so CPC was just awarded by HCR a $250 million grant program to electrify 10,000 homes. And we are standing up the program now. We have lots of partners. And I think our biggest challenge is awareness. Is getting to, because they want us to do it outside of our typical customer base, because the state has already got policies to electrify the affordable housing stock in the way they are transitioning, per their own plan, all of their products to only subsidized deals that are compliant with the CLCPA, which is phenomenal. And it's because Ruth Ann Wisnauskas, the president of HCR, was on the Climate Action Council and co-chaired that committee with Janet Joseph. And so she became aware, like, how can I award a project that's going to hook up to gas? I can't do it if the laws on the books say that everything has to be electric. And so they're transitioning all of their programs now, which is phenomenal. So I'm trying to reach mom and pop. It's 5 to 50 unit buildings across the state of all different types. How do I even begin to think about doing that? And one of the things that makes me a little nuts is that people aren't aware of what they need to do relative to their electricity or their energy efficiency, but they're certainly aware of what it takes to get an open concept in their home, right? They're aware of transforming the homes they live in, but just not with the right lens. They all want things that the television is telling them they want, because all of these shows are flipping and flopping and, loving it or listing it. And all of those are opportunities that we're leaving on the table to show how you can put solar panels on those homes, how you can drive energy efficiency in passive house. And so, one of my other dreams, because I'm a dreamer and a cartoon person, is to just have the governor pick up the phone and talk to, HGTV and say, hey, can we get into the future here and start to use these technologies? And so I know that's on NYSERDA's radar somewhere. Are there other ideas about how to generate awareness so that all of the great work that you do is magnified and through the megaphone.
A great example, actually, I couldn't agree more. A great example of, I think, really coming together with the utilities has been our Clean Heat campaign, which was launched on a commission order and necessitated a broader awareness campaign around heat pump technologies, both for heating and cooling, as a central aspect of this change. It is also the case that we see the same necessity on the topic of induction cooking, that there is a perception that gas is better, and that's like similarly deeply rooted in both history and very strong marketing campaigns, of course, but those are the types of information that we at NYSERDA are actually being asked to stretch, to say, yes, you need to reach the public, like people on the ground, through your work. And in fact, one common request has been to launch a broader public awareness campaign associated with the climate law as a general matter, and specifically the actions contained within the final scoping plan that we'll be voting on at the end of the year. And so we actually allocated money in our RGGI budget to do just that, because it's obvious. It's obvious that this comes down to education. In at least the first instance. There's many elements of this, and one thing I am not is a marketing professional, but I'm learning along the way about the various ways in which you can reach the public, including the many ways that marketing firms know everything, every move that we are making as well. So definitely part of this expanded necessity that we're seeing and embracing.
I think we're going to take
Are we getting the hook?
No, I hate to interrupt the conversation, but I do need to keep us on schedule. We have to open it up for questions.
Sure.
Very good.
Here's a question. I think they're going to come around with a microphone.
Yes, thank you very much for your enlightening fireside chat discussion. One of my questions is around pain points. If we reach a point where there's not enough natural gas, and clearly renewables are, as you so clearly stated, are a very small percentage, netting out hydro as an example. But my question is, isn't it better to try and up the supply of natural gas and oil? Not that I'm an energy transition person, so I'm just putting a disclaimer on that part, but to really make sure that we're instituting policies like using the federal credits, like the NYSERDA programs, to push heat pumps and other ways to reduce carbon and at the same time create more local self-sufficiency, but not do it at the expense of short-term pain, because consumers, I think, this will backfire in a big way. If people start really feeling pain, they're going to say, why are we doing this electrification so quickly? Yeah, we want to save the planet, but we want to stay warm in the winter and we want to stay cool in the summer. So I'm kind of the school that you kind of need to go drive and get both directions as fast as you can, as opposed to just reducing access to gas and moving towards electrification solely. So I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Ask John Rhodes. No, just kidding. Just kidding. No, listen, I mean, the moment in which we are, as I had said earlier today at a different speaking engagement, I really embrace and recognize the fact that it's messy where we sit today, because of the fact that we have this pipeline of projects that need to get built, need to start delivering. And in the meantime, we need to ensure and throughout, right? We need to ensure a reliable, safe, cost-effective supply of electricity and energy to New Yorkers. And that's why I say this winter, NYSERDA has a responsibility for fuel security, and specifically some of the liquid fuels markets that I'm looking at right now, including kerosene, which I was just reading about. It's a real challenge right now. So you're absolutely right. We cannot transition in a way that is either, how to put it, is abrupt, is in a way that impacts people's supply, that impacts their price in ways that make it untenable to heat and cool their homes, et cetera. And that's the messy thing about where we sit today. And that's why this Climate Action Council, I think, is so unique and so valuable, because the chair of the Public Service Commission sits on the Climate Action Council. And he becomes sort of the counterpoint, right? We're working together to ensure that all of these conditions are met, and very near-term decisions that are made with respect to either the sort of permitting or re-upping of permits of existing plants, they're examined in that context, the context of reliability and the context of real price controls as well. And that's why it's tough. You know, you make decisions in the near term which may not be in direct alignment with the longer term objectives, because you're needing to sort of navigate this mid-transition that we're all part of.
Yeah, I just also want to highlight that really doing this in a way that protects people in disadvantaged communities is important. And the reason that the state and I think the IRA and a lot of the resources are focused on disadvantaged communities is because if everyone else transitions and you leave our poorest, most marginal people on gas and oil infrastructure that is no longer getting the kind of investment that it needs, you're just exacerbating the problem and exacerbating negative outcomes for a population of people that have been subject to negative outcomes for decades. And so it's really, it's a perilous transition if you don't do both in a way that you know, that does this, right? Where you cross over and you get to electrification, but not on the backs of a low and moderate income population of people that are going to be most impacted. So I really respect the laws and at the state and federal level for looking out to protect those populations. We have a question up here.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I'm from the town of East Hampton, and I'm involved in the Energy and Sustainability Advisory Committee for the town. We unanimously passed a recommendation to the town just this summer that all new buildings, both commercial and residential, should be electrified. The town hasn't taken this up yet because the litigation fear is intense throughout the state, and we would be the first small municipality to be doing this. And since they're already being litigated against as far as offshore wind is concerned, which, by the way, Sadie, is 30 miles offshore. I doubt we're going to be seeing those fabulous turbines that are going to provide 77,000 homes worth of energy come next fall. So there's lots of exciting things going on in my town, but the litigation thing is a problem. And particularly because it's still that exact same recommendation sits in the state in committee. And I'm wondering how we can lift that so that municipalities can move forward in this regard, because we're stymied right now.
Do you want to speak to it with respect to Local Law 97? I mean, where a lot of these same, I can speak to the state perspective.
Yeah. Why don't you start and I'll prepare my thoughts. So it's a big one.
It is a big one, and in fact, tomorrow at the Climate Action Council meeting, this is exactly a topic we'll be talking about, which is how will our housing chapter of the final scoping plan look? We looked, and in fact, included in the governor's executive budget was a very similar proposal last year that ultimately didn't move forward. And it doesn't move forward for a variety of reasons. That's a sort of a strategic question as far as I'm concerned. The reality is when we look at sort of how we can achieve these objectives, there's very few paths other than electrification that one would take. I mean, there are some potential utilization of fuel-based resources, Con Ed steam system as a great example, but others as well. But at the end of the day, given the climate law and the constraints within it, the housing panel really came out and said, here's the pathway to get from here to there. Here's what the numbers show. And so the challenge just becomes the actual act of doing it. And as I said, those are legislative strategies, this classic carrot and stick debate as to, sort of incentivizing versus requiring. All of those are actions that we'll be advancing on a statewide basis in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, where my mind went to was, giving you tools to fight against to get out from under litigation, right? And so what could you fall back on? And the obvious one is the building code, which does not call for this. And that, to me, like I've always thought, change the code, change the world. it needs to be more consistent. I mean, if we can have all of this activity in New York State and not have a common building code calling for this, like, I can't wrap my mind around that. And you know, there's lots of communities that have become NYSERDA designated, I forget what you're calling them.
Clean energy
Clean
communities.
energy communities, and they're adopting the stretch code. And
Yep.
you know, at the end of the day, if the code says you have to do it, sue me all you want, but it's the code, right? So the other thing that's really important, particularly in New York City for smaller buildings, is it can't be an unfunded mandate. You have to provide people with tools. Like they can get as angry as they want, but if you give them a path forward or a way to get their code is obviously one way. But you know, at CPC we're advocating very strenuously to bring back J51 in New York City, which was the tax abatement program that was rolled out in the 70s that gave you 20 years of no taxes if you invested in distressed neighborhoods and provided new housing. And think the Harlem and the South Bronx when the South Bronx was burning, et cetera. And that tax abatement program drove tons of investment into vacant buildings. The tax abatement alone, coupling it with all of the other resources that HPD and other agencies provided, and you got to real scale around affordable housing. But that incentive, you could bring back J51, call it E51, call it D51, whatever you want to call it, and give fully real estate tax-paying buildings, it doesn't have to just be housing, it can be commercial too, the ability to offset the expense side of their equation, because real estate is all about income over expense, that's it. It's all about cash flow, and so if you're taking cash flow away by adding cost to electrify, because let's also be very honest, it costs a lot of money to do this, and electricity costs more than gas or oil right now. So not just are you taking on the burden of the capital cost up front, you're taking on the burden of a higher expense unless you drive deep energy efficiency into that building, which you're just adding to the capital cost on the other side, right? And so, but if you have a tax abatement which offsets some of that cost for a certain amount of time, until perhaps the utility costs even out a little bit and electricity comes down, that helps. But you have to look at the math, right? At the end of the day, it's about the math of whether an investment makes sense. And so if it doesn't make sense, look at affordable housing. You can't build affordable housing with low-income rents, right? If you're going to have poor people live in it and they can only pay 25% of a market rent, you're not going to build it unless you have something that says, okay, here's a resource. So you subsidize that in any number of ways. Capital resources up front, tax abatements on the expense side, higher rents through Section 8. I mean, we're throwing every tool, everything in the kitchen sink at affordability because the capital markets don't provide for affordable housing. It's going to be similar in the early adoption phase for climate and for decarbonization and electrification. We can't sit back and just expect people to do it. We have to say to the utility companies, to New York taxation, we have to say to appraisers who don't value it properly. We have to say to landlords who don't understand that they might be able to charge more money, and to underwriters, lenders who are not recognizing the value or the savings that you might get if you build something to passive or net zero. The entire system has to wake up and say, okay, how can we all come together during the early adoption phase so that we can work out some of this stuff until we get to this being business as usual, right? We have to get to business as usual. This is not business as usual now. This is new and hard and nobody wants to do it. So what happens, your boiler breaks, you call the guy on the other end of the phone, he comes out and he sells you the same boiler. He's not selling you electrification because it's too hard for him too. He's not getting the incentives that he needs. And he's following a code that's not requiring it. So and the thing I love about what NYSERDA has done when the Climate Action Council is try to address these things at the wholesale level, but now it's time to push that stuff down to the retail level, where all of it is happening in real time and the decisions are actually being made around what the practitioners who are responding to the policies are trying to get done. And so, we participated with NYSERDA, CPC, and the New York Fed to convene capital providers, appraisers, insurance companies. Insurance costs are skyrocketing. All of the the many players in the capital ecosystem. We got them together because it wasn't one of the departments of government that was at the table during the Climate Action Council. The Department of Financial Services was not there. And CPC raised their hand and said, that's not right. We are not the experts in capital. We are just one small retailer of capital, solutions. And so broadly, the New York Fed came in and we convened all of these people, white papers coming out this month, to help talk to some of those broader issues and get people to come together during the early adoption phase, like they did in the 1970s when they needed to address disinvestment in neighborhoods in urban centers across the country. It wasn't just a mortgage that got you there. It was a mortgage, a tax abatement, a subsidy. In the case of small cities upstate, the utility companies even participated. We got everybody to the table. It's not easy to do, but during this early adoption, it has to get done. So I think there's another question down here.
I'm Michael Bell. I've been an advisor to Our Energy Policy since its inception, and I'm a professor of physics. I've co-authored papers in energy policy. Sadie, you mentioned a word, resilience, and I want to return to that in the following context. Resilience in both generation and in delivery of electricity. On the generation side, you're talking about offshore wind, but we know that there are limitations in terms of storms and what those can do to that kind of generation. In terms of resilience, though, downstate is a regional area. What kind of regional planning is being done with, for example, Connecticut and New Jersey? And the other bugaboo in this whole thing is energy storage. If you're going to be resilient, you've got to have that. And from my perspective, right now, we don't have the necessary technologies, and I hope that NYSERDA is going to be investing in that.
Yeah, the topic of resilience needs to be central not only, I think in the first instance, because of the fact that all of these assets are being built in the face of not only a changing climate, but the impacts of that changing climate. Like, that's the facts of the matter. We are at the point of, avoid, minimize, mitigate. Well, we're at the, we're all the way through that process, basically, as we think about the assets that we are building today in our state. And that comes down, in fact, our board, NYSERDA board, talks a lot about this topic because the question becomes, how are our investments resilient with respect to those realities? But it is also the case that the heavy reliance on the grid of the future means that the grid itself needs to be made more resilient, because that is one of the primary reasons we hear when we talk about the change that we're talking about here as a state, is people say, well, wait a minute, that means I won't have, the power goes out all the time and I won't have anything. I won't even have heat, for those, some who are able to heat now if the power's out. So it is the case that our grid itself needs to be brought to bear in that respect as well. And in fact, we are conducting a very interesting study about the topic of undergrounding on a statewide basis. Not that I ever would expect we would underground every possible transmission line in the state, but I think it's important to say there are some pieces of our grid that could be hardened by virtue of investments of that nature. The topic of energy storage, I completely agree with you. In fact, the study that supports our integration analysis would say that we are looking at many, many gigawatts of energy storage, dozens of gigawatts, in fact, into the future. And it is the case that that energy storage can't always be the type of storage that we're installing now, which would be like a 2 to 4 hour duration storage asset. That's why we use the term long duration energy storage. These are the technologies our innovation team is investing in now that will be the technologies that are deployed at scale in the future. And that's, part of the challenging part about all of this for people to really understand is that we have to recognize that we don't know what technologies we'll be using in 2040 and 2050, even though we're taking steps today to realize that future, because we see these technologies moving forward at a pace and with, I would say, an imperative because of the need for them to be realized in the future. The investments we're making are bolstered by so many others. We just invested, as I said, in 7 different projects. Couple are new chemistries, like different chemistries that could be utilized for storage, as an example. We're looking at storage within an offshore wind turbine. That's an interesting project. A little mini hydro facility, as an example, and beyond. That's what we need to be doing today.
We have time for one more question. I'll make it quick. Another. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Micah Koch, I'm an investor at Blackhorn Ventures, industrial decarbonization, but I'm a proud NYSERDA alum. Thank you, Doreen and Sadie, for your leadership. I wanted to ask a question about jobs and career development, and maybe reconciling kind of the silver tsunami that we see around energy and utilities with record levels of youth unemployment, not only on the blue collar side, but also on the white collar side. I've been in this space for almost 2 decades here in New York, and never before have I seen the amount of talent that is entering into what now we call climate tech, right? So while there's been a much larger market correction in tech overall, I think what you're seeing, particularly here in New York, is people who come from either big tech or different industries bring those networks and perspectives into the space and starting new companies, which I think is great for New York's economic development and jobs. But the issue of heat pumps has come up a couple of times. I would argue that supply chain issues aside, the real issue is workforce, right?
Yeah.
Just fragmented workforce, really low levels of quality assurance, if you can get someone. And so it's really reconciling this idea of how do you retrofit affordable housing? In your case, Sadie, you brought up 10,000 units of affordable housing retrofits. Local law 97, again, aside, massive demand there with the skill sets that ultimately need to be built, not just for jobs on roofs, installing panels, et cetera, but really for careers in the clean energy economy. So just curious to get your thoughts as to what the state is doing to build out the workforce, both on kind of the blue collar side and on the white collar side, so we can capitalize on the transition.
Sure, I'll start with a few high-level metrics. I'm glad you asked the question, because it's a huge challenge, actually, that we're seeing broadly at this moment, which is who's going to do all this work, right? We produced a job study as part of our draft scoping plan, in which we touted the fact that there'll be 10 jobs gained for every job lost in this transition, and that our clean energy workforce, 160,000 strong, we're back to pre-COVID levels, is going to need to grow by orders of magnitude, right? And so on the first instance, that's like really good news, one would say, that we're making these investments and that we'll see the jobs coming from these investments. But on the other hand, to your point, there is a need for the people to be ready to actually serve the industry. And I would agree with you fully that where we see the majority of these jobs occurring will be in the housing space. That's where you just need the most number of people working. And as such, those people need to be trained and ready to deliver in ways that ensure quality, which is a very real market development challenge that we have specifically in that sector, where the quality of work, the knowledge of just like the boiler person that Sadie was referring to, that all needs to transition to a point not only of awareness but expertise, and at a scale that is far greater than it is today. So, in terms of what we do about it, we in NYSERDA are investing actually quite significantly in workforce development, and are going to be enhancing those investments with investments brought forward by Empire State Development here in New York, as well as federal money as well. And I say this because it is not just the scale of the investment, but it's the type of people that we are reaching. Many of these programs have a foundational commitment to work with the trades, i.e. organized labor in the installation and operation of the systems that are being installed or being advanced. And really what that means is we need to work more closely with unions and with other providers who are feeding those unions to ensure that our work isn't going just to universities or to various community organizations, et cetera, that we've historically worked with. We need to figure out how to get into those frameworks to bring forward more workers, and by the way, more diverse workers and workers from communities that need help with access to even the training in the first instance. So at NYSERDA, a great example is we provide everything from bus passes to lunch vouchers to childcare services, et cetera, really trying to get at the issue, which is access for the types of folks that we need to be part of that workforce as well. No great answers, but definitely expansion of our investments.
I would say we had a lot of great answers. Can we have a hand for Sadie, Doreen? We obviously could go on for a long time, but we're very grateful to both of you for taking the time to share your thoughts with everyone. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Something that you said, Doreen, really struck me about the need to bring all the pieces together to achieve these ambitious goals that we have, and that they are achievable if we can bring all those pieces together. And we look forward to working with you and with everyone in this room to be a vehicle for facilitating, as a nonpartisan organization, people coming together, whether it's in larger forums or in some of the smaller roundtable sessions we talked about earlier, to try to get well-meaning people to sit down and discuss innovative ways, consensus ways to move things forward. So thanks again to all of you, to all of our partners and supporters, to BP as our co-host today. I want to thank our OEP staff, Liza Roberts, Daisy Yu, and Carolyn Best, for all the hard work that they put in today. In fact, they deserve a round of applause. And please be on the lookout for our next event here in a couple of months, for our webinars that are coming up. And I wish all of you a great day rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
That's great.